Okay, I thank again all the participants to our conference. It has been a conference full of interesting contribution, both in the plenary and parallel sessions. And in this respect, I invite you again to submit them for publication, both in the series of Astrid working papers and in the journals Economia e Lavoro and Bulletin of Political Economy. We encountered during the conference some technical problems, but in most cases, I can say, we managed to solve them. In closing our conference, I want, of course, to thank Professor Setterfield of the New School for Social Research for accepting our invitation to hold the final lecture of the conference and sharing with us his reflections and ideas on the economic and social consequences of the crisis that occur following the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that there is no need to introduce Professor Setterfield. I believe you all know him. He has published an enormous amount of articles and books. He is among the leading post-Keynesian economists, and he is now the director of the Department of Economics at the New School. I then give the floor to Professor Setterfield for his final lecture entitled Economic Consequences of and Policy Responses to the COVID-19 Pandemic, a Post-Keynesian Perspective. And I thank him again to be here with us.
Thanks very much, Sergio. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So let's just make sure that everybody can see my screen. Great.
Yes, we see them.
Super. Okay.
Yes, we see the slide.
Great. So thanks again, Sergio, for that introduction. And in fact, thank you and the conference organizers for inviting me along to give this closing talk. I gave a couple of talks on the theme of the COVID crisis back in April at the New School. And at that point, I thought it actually might develop into a line of research. It didn't in the end because I became more of a participant in the COVID crisis. I'm glad to say not because of any health effects on myself or my family, but simply because it turned out that 2020 was a spectacularly bad year to be chairing a department, especially at the notoriously disorganized New School. So a lot of what I'm going to say today is a little more sort of back of the envelope, as it were, and conjectural than some of the research that I've heard presented at the conference, which has been a little bit more considered. But I hope, nevertheless, that it will be interesting and useful, especially as a way of bringing the discussion at the conference to an end. Now, the other thing that I think I ought to say by way of introduction here is best left to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who famously had a character in one of the Sherlock Holmes stories say, "Everything I have to say has already crossed your mind." And I expect that that is the case. Obviously, we're at least 9 months into this crisis, depending on exactly how you count. It's been the focus of worldwide attention, and I don't think anybody hasn't thought about it. In fact, it almost seems that most people have already written about the COVID crisis and its economic consequences. Nevertheless, I hope to say something of value. So let me proceed to give you some sense of how I'm going to structure the talk. Essentially, it's in two parts. I want to think about where we stand in terms of how the crisis has unfolded so far, and then think a little bit more conjecturally about the prospects for recovery. And then take on this question, what is to be done? In other words, thinking about policy interventions. So first of all, there's an existing history of policy interventions. There's the question, of course, of what policy interventions are still to come and what ought to come. Then there is a still broader question about the whole political economy of the COVID-19 moment. Now, I thought originally that that might be the most novel part of this talk until I heard Giovanni speak yesterday. And it turns out that Giovanni has already not just written, but in fact published on aspects of what I have to say there in that last section of my talk. But I'm going to be, or try to be at least, a little bit more general than he is and or was, and think about, let's call it an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario, building out of the COVID-19 moment and how that might affect capitalist economies worldwide on a longer term basis, quite independently of the crisis itself and its end. So let's start at the beginning, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek here. This slide is titled "This Time is Different," because isn't that what economists always say when we enter some kind of crisis? But, well, more specifically, what I mean here is that it's clear this is the second recession in succession that has been of historic proportions. But nevertheless, the current recession is very different from the previous one. The Great Recession was made at home. We all know that. It emanated from structural failings within the economy itself, specifically the unsustainability of certain financial processes, especially in the US and to a lesser extent, but significantly the UK economies that were then transmitted elsewhere. And of course, thanks to the structure of the Eurozone, were subsequently, albeit unnecessarily, propagated into sovereign debt crises. The COVID-19 recession, however, you might think of, and I think reasonably, as being about as close as possible to an exogenous shock, because of course COVID-19 is a pathogen. It doesn't even come from the social realm. It's a natural phenomena. And so clearly then the causes of this recession are quite different from the causes of the previous one, even though, you know, here we go again, in a sense, with yet another historically deep, possibly, as we'll see, persistent recession. Well, all right, so what? Well, if we think of the COVID-19 economic crisis as emanating from an initial sort of essentially natural and exogenous shock, we might liken it in the first instance, and I think this was quite reasonable back in the spring, to sort of like stepping on a hose pipe. So if I'm watering my garden, I plug the hose pipe into the tap, and the water flows through and the plants are watered. But if I intentionally or unintentionally step on the hose pipe, obviously I constrict the pipe itself. That reduces the flow of water, but only as long as I'm standing on the hose pipe. If I take my foot off, then, you know, hose pipes are generally fairly elastic. We'd expect them to kind of recover their initial form, and the through flow of water would resume. Now, that is what the crisis might have been like had it been short-lived and geographically limited. So that many of us who were sort of rather complacently looking at events unfold in China back in January and February might have liked to believe that, well, look, if it's just going to be limited to that part of the world, then the only thing for us to discuss is an interruption to global supply chains, and, you know, what sort of vulnerability global supply chains then introduce by virtue of a regional crisis. But otherwise, if it had been contained and limited in that sense, there might have been a sort of short, sharp, V-shaped recession, the type of bounce back, as it were, that Gennaro was talking about yesterday in the plenary on Italian macroeconomics, where a sort of artificial restriction to what up to that point had been, at least in the course of the expansion that was underway, business as usual, that was then alleviated, resulting in the resumption of business as usual. But that isn't, of course, how things have unfolded, and I think we're long past the point now, as I'll eventually explain, of simple bounce back recoveries. Instead, of course, as we know, the virus went global, and consequently, so did the initial response to it, the sort of restrictions to production and trade that were necessary, and both the extent, I think, and the persistence of those restrictions mean that at this point, as my slide suggests here, this is where the demand side comes in. I think also, and more significantly, this is where we sort of leave the natural realm as an explanation of the economic crisis, and we enter the economic and social realm. I think that what we've experienced to date now and what we will experience going forward has much more profound basis in recognizable economics. So in the first instance, as we would all readily recognize, my stepping on a hosepipe analogy is somewhat inappropriate from a post-Keynesian perspective, because you're never going to get a purely supply-side event. Restricting production and trade is, of course, going to shut down income flows, which will shut down the expenditures funded by those income flows, which will further, of course, annihilate expenditures and so on. That's an ordinary multiplier process, and I think we can all recognize then that even a shock outside the economy that initially seems to take the form of a supply shock is going to be amplified by a recognizable demand-side economic mechanism in the form of a multiplier effect. And of course, that would have happened even if there had been that sort of geographically and temporally limited V-shaped phenomena. The depth of the V would have undoubtedly been a product of the demand-side multiplier. As it is, of course, we've got a crisis that is bigger, deeper, more extensive, and more persistent. And so the amplification that I'm talking about here, the multiplier effect, of course, is only going to be sort of larger as a result of that. But beyond multiplier effects amplifying a crisis that had an exogenous cause, I think more significantly, what has happened over the past 9 months is that economic mechanisms have taken over as causal drivers of economic outcomes that we're now witnessing, and that there are potentially more such economic drivers of what is to come. Here's what I have in mind specifically. So never mind the initial amplification, the COVID shock as a result of the multiplier. What we also simultaneously got, of course, was a massive heightening of uncertainty. And from a post-Keynesian perspective, of course, that's only going to increase liquidity preference as a hedge-like precaution against what then becomes an uncertain future, I would say, along 2 dimensions. There's the uncertainty, of course, of interacting with other people and its health consequences, interaction in production and trade. There's also, of course, the uncertainty that is, if you like, purely economic about future income flows. So that quite regardless of whether or not I myself am going to go out into social settings and risk falling ill, there's the question of who else is doing that and how it might or might not affect my income. So I think this becomes early on in the crisis an important causal driver then of both the depth and, as we'll see, the potential persistence of the economic crisis. What is still to come, I think, is the possibility that if the losses as a result of the mechanisms I've discussed so far are sufficiently sustained and large, then we can add what I would call a financial dimension to the crisis. Yesterday, Gennaro mentioned a recent Libby Institute policy note by Jan Kregel. And I believe if I'm thinking of the paper that Gennaro was referring to, Jan actually is starting to predict a forthcoming Minsky moment. That might be a little dramatic. I've taken a sort of softball approach here and suggested that the crisis that is currently unfolding may take on what I call the financial dimension. But I think we can all recognize that there are households and small businesses that are clearly sort of hanging on by a thread at the moment. And if in fact they go into default, then of course the financial dimension of the crisis that will result from default, destruction of wealth, destruction of confidence in financial markets, can only worsen the crisis as we experience it over, at least the next sort of 6 months or so. That, I think, is an effect that, of course, is all yet to come. So this is where I think, in brief, we stand. It's where we started and where we've come from over the past 9 months. An initial downturn that you could sort of see as being what an optimist might have thought being an exogenous event in an otherwise sort of roughly healthy economy that should have been short-lived and resulted in a bounce-back economy. that has long since become more complicated by economic factors. Heightened liquidity preference as a response to uncertainty about both health and economic circumstances, the possibility of everything we've experienced so far becoming exacerbated by processes of default, so that at the end of the day now, as we look ahead, and even at the juncture where we're, of course, now witnessing the rollout in certain countries of vaccinations, the question I think that we face is whether the recession that we're in and the prospects for recovery then involve a U-shaped or even an L-shaped recession. And in fact, this was the title of one of my early talks at the New School in April, Don't Let U-shape Become L-shape, where at that point I was not reflecting back on, but predicting something that was always going to be more U-shaped than V-shaped by way of a recession, and worrying about the prospect of it turning into an L-shaped event. So let me begin here then by just making clear what I mean by an L-shaped recession, because what I'm really referring to is what I was always taught to describe when I was studying economic history as a depressed upswing. It's really not a recession, actually. It's a sort of an anemic boom. So a good illustration actually is on this slide here. The graphic is a little bit small, but let me just explain what you see there, just so that it's clear. The blue line on the graphic is the actual path of US GDP in real terms since the second quarter of 1991. So using NBER business cycle dating, the period on this graph from the second quarter of 1991 through late 2007 is what I call the neoliberal boom, the two consecutive trade cycles in the US in the 1990s and the 2000s that make up essentially a long boom in US activity that, without going into too much detail here, some might think of as being the upturn of the contractive, long wave of economic activity that was then in some fashion terminated by the crisis associated with the Great Recession. And you can see the Great Recession on this graphic. It's the sort of cliff edge that manifests about 60% away through the graph if you're moving from left to right, circa 2008-9. And the point that I'm trying to make here is, what does an L-shaped recession look like, or really a depressed upswing? And here we see what it looks like. The path of GDP, the blue line, of course, growth resumes. So technically the Great Recession ends in the US in 2009, and we get back into positive quarter-on-quarter, year-on-year GDP growth. But it's never strong enough to ever get back towards approximating the previous trend path. Okay, the yellow line here that I've described in the legend as a line of best fit. It's just a very sort of cheap estimate of the time trend of GDP with a time trend squared term to allow for, of course, the nature of compound growth here. So it's a very sort of cheap indication of the trend that in GDP during the neoliberal boom, and then a projection of that trend, which again, as you can clearly see, is never approximated in the boom that unfolded in the US after 2009. And of course, just as an aside here, this phenomena is of course what has attracted the attention of a number of heterodox economists, including, I know some of those at Roma Tre, because the reason that economies have appeared tight, including the US economy, by sort of 2019 is because of the notorious downward revision in estimates of potential GDP. Certainly not because of especially robust growth of real GDP. So this is all part and parcel of that discussion that I know some of you have participated in about the measurement of potential GDP in light of its relentless sort of downward revision in countries like the US over the last 10 or so years. Okay, so that's what I mean by an L-shaped recession. I'm using the what I call the depressed upswing in the US after the Great Recession as an exemplar of that. Now, on the far right of my graph, you can see, of course, another cliff edge, and that's the COVID crisis. That's the shutdown that occurred in the US in the second quarter of this year. So the question then is, are we now set for a sort of a U-shaped recovery or another L-shaped trajectory? Well, here's another graphic, which again is this time the blue line, which is now being concealed to some extent by my yellow line of best fit. This is just, the blue line now is just real GDP in the US since the onset of this depressed upswing, as I've called it, in 2009. And the yellow line is a very tight fit this time because it's just a crude estimate of the exponential trend of GDP over the course of that boom. And really the value of this, again, it's just a very sort of cheap way of indicating where we now stand in the far right of this graphic in the COVID crisis. We can see we've gone off the cliff edge. Of course, the initial shutdown was very widespread and very severe. There's been subsequent reopening of activity that was previously closed, so there's been some bounce back. But you can see just by extrapolation of the previous trend that we're still in a recession relative to where output otherwise seemingly would have been. And the question that this graph now poses is, where do we go next? Does the sort of sudden bounce back of the blue line continue? And do we get something more like a V-shaped recession? Well, I certainly don't think so. Or does the U-shape that will, I think, unfold become potentially L-shaped? I think these are the questions that we have to answer. In other words, the question is how much more or less what happens next looks like this. So let me just explain what this graphic is, because it's not based on real data. It's actually a simulation. And it's taken from a paper by two of our students, actually. Maria is at Roma Tre, and Ettore is at the New School, where, for better or worse, he's working under my supervision. So quite literally what this graphic is a simulation based on their predator-prey model of the COVID-19 crisis. What they've done is they've modeled the crisis as essentially a predator-prey interaction of the COVID-19 infection rate and the employment rate. So this is what they're suggesting would happen specifically to GDP if we just sort of let this virus loose in the population, and consequently as people go to work, they infect each other, so then people have to sort of go home because they're getting ill, and then as people recover and as the infection rate dies down, they go back to work and start reinfecting each other again. So effectively, this is almost like a sort of purely supply-side interaction of employment and economic activity on the one hand, and health or ill health on the other. But it's useful for my purposes because it illustrates, again, the potential here for the unfolding of at least a U-shaped event, if not an L-shaped event. What's missing from this simulation, because of its structural basis in this predator-prey interaction that I've just described, is any of the demand-side drivers of the crisis, as I see them at least, and as I was discussing a few minutes ago. So the problems with heightened uncertainty and increased liquidity preference, the potential problems with default, destruction of wealth, and disinclination to borrow and lend. None of those are formally captured here. But both of them, of course, could give rise to a similar subsequent pattern of developments following the events that we see in this previous slide, where the seeming aggressive recovery falters and eventually sort of levels out at a rate of expansion where there is this sort of lingering recession. Perhaps what happens is the economy eventually recovers towards the previous trend path, and perhaps again, if the severity and the persistence of the recession is sufficient, it never does, and we have another L-shaped event. Of course, all of that remains to be seen, but I think the important point to note here is that earlier I was talking about two sources of uncertainty, one purely connected with health and safety. If I go to the store or if I go to work, will I get infected or will I infect other people? The other is economic. Do I have sufficient confidence, and as a result of that confidence, am I willing to spend rather than to sort of hoard for precautionary reasons as a hedge against the uncertainty of the future? I think it's important to note at this point, especially as we're now, thank goodness, seemingly on the cusp of rolling out vaccinations, that even if we actually eliminate the health concern altogether, suppose from an epidemiological perspective, it's possible for a medic to say to the world, the virus has successfully been eradicated. Sufficient people now have been vaccinated, that we know that herd immunity exists. It's perfectly safe for you to sort of carry on with your usual business as it would have been sort of circa January 2020. Well, that's all very well. It may be true objectively from a medical point of view, but the behavioral response to that in the economy may actually not be as elastic as things might have been had the crisis been shorter and less severe. In other words, we might not find a rebound in behavior. Uncertainty about economic prospects might persist. There may even be sort of skepticism of exactly how safe it is to go back to work, to go out to the store. Any of those reasons, again, will create essentially assistance of the economic causes of the recession that we're now experiencing, even if the original health and safety cause, as it were, the virus, is eliminated altogether. So there are good reasons, I think, to think that conditions will persist at least. So, the question then becomes, how long do we have this U-shaped event? How long does it take before we finally sort of claw our way back towards the previous trend? In other words, if you go back 2 slides, looking at what I've called the neoliberal boom, the 2 trade cycles in the 1990s and the 2000s in the US were sort of U-shaped recoveries. They were initially jobless. They took a while to get going. They did eventually get going. Of course, the 1990s in the US was eventually called the Roaring 90s, but it didn't roar until after 1995. The first 4 years at least of that expansion were anemic, and most of the discussion was of jobless recovery. So both of those recessions and recoveries in the neoliberal boom look sort of U-shaped. Both of them were discussed initially, at least, as jobless recoveries. And then, as I say, you've got the L-shaped event exemplified by the most recent trade cycle boom after the Great Recession. And I think right now the question is, which of those do we get this time around? Is it going to be sort of more U-shaped like the 1990s, or is it going to be more L-shaped like the 2010s? And well, partly, of course, we have to wait and see. But partly, of course, I think this is going to be a product of what we do next, which, of course, then brings us to policy, because part of what happens next is going to be play out in the public policy sphere, and it's going to affect the conditions that then materialize in the economy. So turning to the policy response now, as we've observed it, and then as it may be going forward, as it were, in the year or years to come. So assessing the policy response is difficult in the sense because it varies by country, so it's difficult to generalize, but nevertheless, I'm going to try to generalize. And the way I'm going to try to generalize about policy here is to think of it in terms of sort of the response of neoliberalized economies. As far as I can see, the lesson to date internationally from the policy response is that whereas the Great Recession demonstrated that essentially neoliberalism is well capable of self-inflicted harm, it can generate its own problems internally, it's also not particularly well prepared for exogenous shocks. It's not even a fair weather model, as it were. A fair weather model does okay in fair weather, and then if an exogenous shock comes along, it struggles. Neoliberalism, it seems to me, is not even a fair weather model because it doesn't need external disturbance to create crises. We saw that last time around with the Great Recession. So if we think in terms of the policy response here and what it tells us about the preparedness of neoliberalism, then there's some prospect here for generalizing. It also allows me again to focus on the US a little bit as a kind of leading edge of neoliberalism. In my opinion, there are still, to a greater or lesser extent, varieties of capitalism around the world. But I think that those varieties of capitalism are all marked, or if you prefer, tainted by neoliberalism. There are just varying degrees of neoliberalization. So the value of the US focus in this context is that you can sort of take the worst case example, one of the most neoliberalized economies, as a result, of course, of it being party to the sort of original Thatcher-Reagan revolution that set us on this course 40 or so years ago. The other thing, by the way, and this is just an aside that occurred to me when I was listening to presentations during the plenary session yesterday on the Italian economy. It struck me at the time, and I suppose this has been obvious all along, that for all of their apparent differences, there are also, I think, important similarities at this juncture between the US economy on the one hand and the Eurozone on the other. They are both, to some extent, failed or failing federal systems. Here's what I mean by that. The discussions yesterday of the Italian economy were all, of course, couched inevitably in terms of the constraints of the Eurozone. Problems that we were all aware of over 20 years ago. Many of us criticized at the time as being essentially an institutional failure by design, because there was a rush to monetary union without adequate fiscal union, and consequently nation states were being turned, their budget constraints were being transformed into something that resembled what those of households or firms, or if you prefer, in the US case, individual states like California or New York or Massachusetts. Of course, the example at the time, and there were people like Jamie Galbraith who were saying this, was that the example for the Eurozone was actually the US, a fully fledged federal system that involved not only monetary union, but also a proper system of internal fiscal transfers. The interesting thing is, however, that system of fiscal transfers has not broken down in the US so much as it's not being used properly. And this, of course, I think is a product of federal policy that has itself been neoliberalized, so that it is, of course, quite possible in the US for the federal government to alleviate the budget constraint that states face at a time like this as a result of historically large losses of tax revenue and their legal inability to run deficits, right, and for their operating expenses to systematically exceed their tax revenues. Ordinarily, there would be federal aid to states that would rectify that problem. And of course, what the federal government is doing there is issuing debt in a currency that it issues, but eliminating, of course, prospects of defaults and so on. But that's actually not happening. It hasn't been for some time. In fact, the explicit line in the waning months of the Trump administration was that if, for example, New York was having fiscal problems, well, that was because it was fiscally irresponsible. And the last thing we wanted to happen was for the federal government to step in and bail out fiscally irresponsible New York. Of course, New York was actually experiencing was the initial onset of the COVID-19 health crisis in the US. So the politicization of the federal system in this country has actually meant that, well, the long and the short of it now, of course, is that I'm and others like me are having to pay more property taxes because towns don't have the tax revenues they need to fund school systems, and they don't because they're not getting money from states, and the states are having to cut back on expenditures because there isn't or there haven't been adequate federal fiscal transfers. So to some extent here then, this is a sort of US-centric analysis that I'm about to embark on, but I think actually there are ways of sort of generalizing it to the European experience, and one of them, unfortunately, is this kind of common condition of either incomplete or failing federal systems in continental-sized economies. Anyway, I'm digressing. Let me get back to the main thread here, which is to just look at the policy responses we've experienced it to date, and then where it might go next and what might happen next as a result. So in the US, the main policy response was early, the so-called CARES Act. And I think if you were scoring this out of 10, you might say it deserved about a 6 out of 10. The scale of the intervention, this is back in March, April, was about right. All of the initial forecasts were for an initial sort of 10% hit to the economy, and the scale of the CARES Act was $2 trillion, which is more or less exactly 10% of the $20 trillion economy. So, okay, massive intervention, but just about right, it would seem. So, full marks for that. But the structure and the distribution of the CARES Act, I think, were quite wrong. And this is actually where some of my comments, I think, dovetail with points that Giovanni and Antonella were making yesterday about, very often now we're seeing willingness to engage in fiscal policy and use fiscal policy to prop up, even stimulate the demand side of the economy. But there's very little attention to the structure and distribution of that policy. And in fact, very often the structure and distribution of it are quite wrong. And that's what a lot of my comments actually will reflect here as I think about what the CARES Act did and did wrong, and what lessons policy might learn from that going forward. So what I mean by problems with the structure here is, again, not the sort of nature of the idea of stimulating the economy or even the size of the stimulus. But in the first instance, there was, I think, too much general stimulus. There was a sort of the political stunt of cutting checks with Donald Trump's face on them and sending them to households whose members were actually just sheltering in place and working online. Meanwhile, of course, the impact of the initial COVID crisis was very asymmetric. There were certain businesses that were being shut down completely, and many small businesses and the employees of businesses that were being shut down were, of course, suffering immediate and total loss of income. So a very asymmetric shock, and there was very little, or in my opinion, insufficient attention to that asymmetry in the structure of the CARES Act. There was a greater need as well to enable small businesses and workers to, as it were, shelter in place. There was no reason to believe that their economic distress was as a result of insolvency. It was really purely a liquidity problem, and providing them with the liquidity to carry on in place would have been much better than allowing a lot of them to close down and then use the unemployment system, which is what the US did do, immediately increasing the size of unemployment payments and extending the UI program. Because, of course, there's a great difference, as we know, between essentially being temporarily furloughed in a way that allows you then to go back to your previous employment and being unemployed. Again, there's an inattention to that important structural difference. And the other thing is that obviously, like the post-Keynesian, I like to talk about the demand side, but I think it was obvious to anybody that was what was also required here was extensive supply management, particularly in the healthcare sector, which, because of the, again, the asymmetry of the impact of COVID-19 on this continent, was desperately needed. There were ventilators and hospital beds lying idle in Missouri that were thousands of miles away from where they were needed in New York and Massachusetts and places like that. So a case then for essentially using, again, a federal government to run the economy almost on a wartime footing, making sure not just that the distribution of existing resources, but also requisitioning production facilities in order to ensure that what was being produced in the first place was appropriate. And none of that was done. It could have been, but it wasn't. So the other thing, of course, is that the distributional aspects of the crisis were And this has been particularly sad, of course, because not only of its economic consequences, but of its implications for health and loss of life. Thinking again about the asymmetry of this crisis, low wage, certainly in the US context, as a result of that status, very often minority workers have been simultaneously underemployed and overworked in this crisis. Overworked in the sense that they were immediately, many of them, deemed essential workers. So they were sent in to drive buses, to collect garbage, to mop floors, etc., without adequate personal protective equipment because they were essential. At the same time, of course, they were unemployed because these are the same low-wage workers that staff hotels, restaurants, etc., that were shut down as a result of the original restrictions. And this phenomenon then has manifested itself in two ways. The first is, of course, as a result of this sort of overwork, as I called it, the disproportionate representation of low-wage minority workers among so-called essential workers. You then see the disproportionate health effects of the crisis on those populations. Infection and death rates among African Americans, for example, in the US, are far higher than they are other, especially white members of the population. Meanwhile, of course, bearing the brunt of unemployment, I mean, like you, I'm sitting at home as a professional worker. I'm still receiving my paycheck, although it is 16% less than it was back in May. That's been the hit that we've taken at the New School as a result of the COVID crisis, at least so far. There were also layoffs at the New School as well. But most of us are, you know, we took our computers home, we're working at home, we're managing. Whereas, of course, many of those low-wage and minority workers who were unemployed actually remain unemployed, so that there's now talk of a so-called K-shaped recovery. We've gone from V-shape, U-shape, L-shape, now K-shape. The idea here is that there's sort of a bifurcation where, following the initial trauma of being closed down, a lot, of course, of high-wage professional workers and their employers have adapted. We're now working remotely and we're carrying on to some extent as usual. Whereas, of course, if you're a low-wage worker in the hospitality industries, then you were made unemployed and remain unemployed. And, and consequently, then there is no recovery at all of any shape or form for that echelon of the population. So again, there are distributional consequences here that were not adequately attended to. There are also international dimensions of these distributional problems. I originally thought that there might be a much more extensive capital flight. Obviously, commodity prices have fallen, and you know that has the usual kind of terms of trade implications for commodity exporting economies. But I think at this point, the most obvious problems that emerged along international lines were the sort of cost shifting within global supply chains. The impact that I've picked out here, this was a popular story several months ago, were the consequences of US corporations like the Gap suddenly cancelling orders that affected Bangladeshi garment workers. And in fact, in some cases, small business owners in Bangladesh who'd already bought the raw materials in order to sort of supply fall and winter clothing to US chains like the Gap, that were suddenly then cancelling those orders. So again, what I call here cost shifting within international supply chains is something else that hasn't been really attended to sufficiently, I think, in the policy response to COVID to date. Well, certainly in the US, if not elsewhere, since the spring, the policy intervention has faltered. But I mean, everything I hope that I've said about the crisis itself suggests that it shouldn't be allowed to falter. I mean, despite the possibility now of viable vaccines, I think there's still a long way to go. There's still a demonstrable need for intervention, certainly to forestall the possibility of the recession that we're in taking on a financial dimension. That's the last thing that we need. So obviously, to some extent, then, if you accept my criticisms of policy to date, then what policy needs to do going forward is attend to those failings and learn lessons from round one. More income replacement in the worst hit industries, and for the worst hit sections of the community, low wage and minority workers, proper attendance to questions of supply management rather than just fiscal stimulus alone. So I think everything that I've said here about the policy response is focused on the US, but again, to try to sort of generalize this a little bit, to my mind, what this illustrates really are the sort of failings of what I think of as the most neoliberalized economy. We've seen again the sort of prospect of a made-at-home crisis, the so-called Great Recession, as a result of the financial failings of the system. I think what the COVID crisis has demonstrated writ large is the lack of preparedness of neoliberalized economies for dealing with severe external shocks. So this now is my entree into thinking about the political economy of this crisis, not only in the short term, but in fact in the longer term. Will the crisis now, if it is understood to reveal yet another failing with neoliberalism, will it actually prove to be a critical juncture in the political economy of advanced capitalism going forward? Well, here what I want to offer are two different scenarios, which I've called an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. So let's begin with the optimistic scenario. So back in the middle of the 20th century, A.J.P. Taylor, actually a famous British economic historian, came up with this notion that, to summarize it crudely, that the British welfare state was actually created during the Blitz, right? That the Luftwaffe, in some sense, built the British welfare state. And the basic argument, and again, I'm sort of putting it crudely here, was that the Blitz, the dropping of the carpet bombing of London in 1940-41, was easily understood as a common external threat, right? And it called for a collective response. If a bomb fell on your house and suddenly members of your family were dead and you had nowhere to live, it wasn't your fault, right? And it wasn't something that you could respond to as an individual. And instead, what happened was that the recognition of that common threat, need for collective response, became common and sort of went viral, so that other problems were similarly perceived as emanating from common external threats and needing collective response. Public health, public education, and even unemployment, right? An obvious point to many of us as heterodox economists, we think of unemployment as an outcome that is visited on the unemployed by failings elsewhere in the economy, whereas, of course, in the popular vernacular, unemployment is an individual failure. People aren't working hard enough, they're lazy, they have the wrong skills. It's a problem that is of their own making, and therefore they should individually sort themselves out if they are going to get back into employment. So we're talking here about the possibility of a kind of change in the collective consciousness that perceives not only COVID itself as a common external threat that needs a collective response, but perhaps other things as well. So an increasing salience here of a kind of need for collective action of the type that, of course, was observed in the more sort of social welfare state-oriented economies of the 50s and 60s. So to put it crudely then, is COVID-19 the new Blitz? Does it actually promote this change in consciousness and undermining the sort of individualistic values of neoliberalism? Or, alternatively, the pessimistic scenario. So first of all, of course, I've already said that as a matter of fact, this crisis has antagonized existing inequalities. So low wage workers, minority workers, they were always already and have been for 40 years suffering from disproportionately high unemployment, disproportionate income stagnation, and so on and so forth. So anything that I was saying a few moments ago about the distribution of economic harm caused by the crisis, well, it's only antagonizing what we've seen for 40 years now. The crisis itself, as it's unfolded so far, has been effectively structurally more of the same, more of what you have experienced for decades. If you're a low-wage or minority worker, the more that things change, the more they stay the same. There's also the possibility, of course, of a neoliberal doubling down response to the crisis itself. And see that, I think, along two different dimensions. One is technological. There are newspaper articles now about, robots are being introduced into hospitals. There are more self-checkouts being introduced into supermarkets in the US. And this is consistent with patterns that we see in the data in the US, that there is now, for all that there has been a steady decline in unemployment since the peak unemployment rate back in sort of April of this year, there is nevertheless a severe increase in long-term unemployment. So the unemployment that we're witnessing as a result of this crisis isn't temporary. It isn't of the furlough kind, people that will go back to work as soon as it is safe from a health and safety perspective, but increasingly it's long-term. And you can see that visibly if you go out into stores that are taking advantage of the crisis, as it were. There is a grocery chain in the US called Whole Foods, which began as a kind of very sort of idealized, better quality organic food and all that sort of thing. Has long since been bought out by Amazon, now owns Whole Foods. And it's interesting to note that during this crisis, it has reduced staffing of checkouts and put in a lot more electronic self-checkouts. And people are being very actively encouraged to use them on the basis of health and safety. Of course, overlooking the fact that what it's doing is lowering the cost of production and doubtless increasing the net worth of Jeff Bezos. So all of those developments are taking place in response to the crisis. There's also the problem, of course, of institutional inertia. What I was talking about under the optimistic scenario, this idea that the crisis creates a heightened awareness of common vulnerabilities and the need then for collective action. That's a sort of changing convention. But it's pulling away from individualistic conventions that suit the interests of private wealth in the status quo. And it's always more difficult to move in that direction, away from the interests of wealth than towards it. And on top of that, of course, we've got the populist politics of division as well, which we've seen certainly in the US with people like Donald Trump at some level pretending that there isn't a virus. Or the example I've given here is that, the simple act of wearing a mask when you're out in public, which, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a bit like being asked to keep to the right-hand side of the road when I drive in the US. I mean, is that antithetical to my freedom? Well, if you take a negative view of freedom, it is, right? Because, hey, somebody's restricting me to the right-hand side of the road. So why can't I drive on the left-hand side? I could if I was back in the UK, maybe I want to do that. But on the other hand, of course, the positive view of freedom is that, in fact, restricting people to the right-hand side of the road liberates them. I can go to the store without risking my life because I don't have to worry about driving around a corner and finding some damn fool that's heading straight towards me at 40 or 50 miles an hour. They're going to be on the opposite side of the road. And again, something like wearing a mask could be seen as liberating in that sense, but it hasn't been. And there's been deliberate fermentation of this because the idea is that, governments are bad, collective action is bad. And this is all very much then reinforcing the status quo ante, that you're on your own. And of course, that includes the folks who own private wealth, who are quite happy to be left to their own devices. They are, not interested in having their activities regulated. As I'll state more explicitly as I conclude, they're certainly not interested in paying for anything that is publicly provided. So this is the pessimistic scenario. And, well, whilst I'm trying to say on the one hand, on the other, I would have to say at the moment on balance, it looks like there are perhaps more grounds for pessimism than there are for optimism. Certainly in the US context, I see less sort of rallying together in response to a perceived common threat and a perceived need for collective action than continuing and possibly even deepening social division. Future, of course, has yet to be made. So we can't rule out, shouldn't rule out the possibility of things changing going forward, partly, of course, as a result of intentional action. So I've been talking for now, I think, about 50 minutes, so let me just wrap up as quickly as I can so we can get on to some discussion. In a nutshell, I think the crisis has revealed another flaw in neoliberal capitalism. It's not only capable of self-harm, as the Great Recession showed us, it's also incapable of adequate response to external sources of harm. The problem is the distribution of that new flaw. We all know, I mean, we don't need reminding, or we haven't needed the COVID-19 crisis to demonstrate this, that neoliberalism increases the vulnerability of the majority of the population to stormy weather, but of course not the sort of wealthy elite. They can buy their own healthcare, they can buy their own education, they can even buy their own security, both economic and physical, and they're not interested in paying for yours or anybody else's. And they don't have to in this system, and that suits them quite nicely. Thank you very much. So it's not surprising then that policy responses have been flawed because they're taking place in the context of this neoliberal environment. So the crisis might be the undoing of neoliberalism, but I would argue only if two things happen. First of all, if this collective consciousness develops, if it coalesces on the need for collective response to common threat, and a similar awareness of the incapacity of economies in their current neoliberalized form to deliver that sort of outcome. But perhaps more importantly, and I haven't said much about this at the moment, but it's in the background of everything I've said, the collective consciousness has to be backed by power. And I think that is what is, as we all well know, even the IMF seems to know that these days, at least when it starts to now relate declines in the wage share to deunionization, that lack of power is the real Achilles heel. So I'm afraid I think it's difficult to be too optimistic, but at least the source of the problems is familiar. I started off by saying this time is different, and effectively here at the end of the day, I'm saying, well, maybe, but it kind of at the same time looks like more of the same. So thanks very much for listening. And Sergio, I think I'll stop there and at least temporarily perhaps come out of this screen sharing mode.
Really thanks, Mark, for your analysis of the consequences also of the possible perspective, the possible scenarios for our future. I don't know if COVID-19 is the new Blitz. I hope it is. And I agree with you that we should pay attention to the structure of fiscal policy and to the distributional aspect. So I wonder if there is some question from the floor, from the audience. Somebody would like to say something?
So much of this, I think, is already familiar.
Antonella, I mean. Antonella?
Yeah.
Yes. Antonella Tirati.
Just two things I noted in your presentation. The first one, you said the recession might persist because of lack of confidence. Of course, lack of confidence is important in such a situation because people maybe, feel very uncertain about the future. But it seems to me that it is not just, or might not be just lack of confidence, but as I said yesterday to Gennaro, lack of actual disposable income, in the sense that it's, it's a bit of a vicious circle insofar as say after vaccination and the end of the pandemic, things do not start altogether to reopen immediately. There will be a lack of income. Also, some income has been lost anyway because some wages have been cut. Some people have not been working for a long, for several months or perhaps more. And they will not have earned their income, so their wealth, if they had any, or savings, will have been consumed, let's say, will have been destroyed. And so it's not just a matter of confidence. Confidence is important, but disposable income is also very important. And from this point of view, my feelings, of course, nobody has certainties that there will be, of course, some bouncing back, because as the activity reopen, things will, work, GDP will increase. But I strongly doubt that it can go back to earlier levels. And the other question is more a curiosity. You said there isn't much of fiscal transfers to individual states from the federal government. How comes, and what has been the effectiveness of? As I read, I mean, the Federal Reserve has been buying bonds from local government, from individual states. Has this helped in some way, compensated for lack of fiscal transfers?
Thank you, Antonella. In a sense, I don't know. Do you want to answer to anybody, or we collect more questions? I don't know.
I'm happy to. Let's see if there are other questions. I'm happy to collect a few questions if there are any. Yes.
Other question? Jonathan Pelleton.
Oh, hi. Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
Hi, Jonathan.
Yes, we hear you.
I just wanted to ask a couple of things, sort of one on the pessimist and one on the optimist side. So perhaps I'll start with the pessimist and then try and get optimistic. So on the pessimist, a few months back, there was an interview with Philip Morawski, who was very downbeat on essentially the neoliberals won't let this crisis go to waste. Things like undermining of social medicine in higher education, increased casualization, thinking that we can now move everything online, undermining environmental protection and justifying about we need to do these things to be able to build back. And so I wonder what your thoughts are there. On the optimist side, I mean, I wonder, first of all, whether this has created more of a space in terms of political economy for fiscal policy, because it demonstrated you can operate fiscal policy, and bond yields will not soar and governments will not go bankrupt or anything of this. And a small thing I was struck by, there was an article in the Financial Times earlier this week that said the reinsurance markets had been called out. They had not expected governments to have the response that they have. And we have to remember quite a few governments have responded rather better than either the British or the American has. And then effectively, governments put a far higher value on people's lives in their response than well-paid reinsurance market makers would have anticipated. And in this context, I mean, I found that a rather positive and optimistic note, and that the power of national democracy to force governments to act is perhaps stronger than we gave it credit for.
Thank you, Jonathan. Other question from the floor? I would like only to add that the observation by Antonella, in a sense, I think applies also to the worries by Jan Kriegel and about the possibility of a Minsky moment of a financial crisis. And I think that it would depend to a great extent on the possible policy measures by the central bank, by the state. So, okay, if there are no other questions, I mean that you can, yes, sure. Olga Osonova, I mean, I don't remember, sorry, your surname.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I want to ask the questions concerning the uneven distribution of wealth in the world and between countries. What do you think how it affects the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios of overcoming pandemic? For example, there is distribution of vaccine will be as well unequal. For example, Ukraine is at the end of receiving vaccine. So how it will affect the whole situation in the world? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nosova. And other question? Okay, I mean, Mark, you can answer to.
Well, thanks to all three of you actually for those interesting questions. And well, let me just go through them in the order in which I received. So starting with Antonella's questions. Antonella, you're absolutely right. So, you know, again, the sort of hose pipe analogy breaks down because a hose pipe has physical elasticity, and the minute you take your foot off it, it just sort of springs back as a result of physics. But that's not how economies work. So you're absolutely right. There is, even if there is a return in confidence, if people have lost their jobs and they don't have any money to spend. So what that amounts to, of course, is, in a sense, if we can get to the point where the causal drivers of what is taking the economy down have been essentially removed, then of course there is a deliberate and purposive need for policy to reflate the economy in the manner that we recognize. And I think, by the way, just to build on what you've said there, you know, I mentioned as the possibility of problems that were like persistence, or even as we were talking about yesterday briefly, hysteresis. You know, if we get into debt problems, that's going to be something that will exaggerate either the severity or the length of the crisis. And I thought that, you know, the comment that Gennaro made when I asked a similar question yesterday was astute, that, of course, the small business sector is going to be affected, where there is essentially the possibility of a certain amount of physical capital scrapping as a result of businesses. You know, it's very different to underutilize capacity and then increase demand and reutilize it. That's very different from a process then of scrapping capacity, and then you're trying to reflate demand in an economy that actually then requires some amount of capital development. The problem is more difficult. And I think this is well known in the 1980s, for example, when you had that kind of conflation of recessions and deindustrialization. The recovery from a recession where you have scrap capacity on the supply side is much harder than recovery from a recession where you just underutilize capacity that is never there and ready to be sort of reutilized. So I think there are all kinds of problems that we're all of us in the heterodox camp have spent plenty of time thinking about over the last 40 years that we can see possibly unfolding over the next couple of years. You know, but they are avoidable to some extent if the right policy response comes into play. And that brings me to your question then about the US policy response. I think you're quite right to say that this is in the US, and this has been true for some time, by the way. You can give at least 2 and possibly even 3 cheers to the Fed. The Fed has never been as hamstrung by law and institutional structure as the ECB, right? I mean, the ECB really is a product of all of the bad stuff in macroeconomics that came out of the 70s and 80s. The Fed isn't, it never has been. And that's been observably true, at least going back to the site of, the sort of willingness even of someone like Alan Greenspan to pursue monetary policies in the 90s, the like of which you would never see the ECB undertaking, subsequent to its formation, certainly prior to the Great Recession. The site of Ben Bernanke going to Capitol Hill and exhorting Congress to engage in fiscal activity. And I think that's the situation we're in now, where once again, even the Trump-appointed governor of the Federal Reserve is saying, look, there's only so much you can do with the small range of monetary instruments that the Fed has at its disposal. We're already doing everything we can do, but you've got this fiscal lever. It's a gigantic thing that you're not pulling on and need to be pulling on. So there's this interesting kind of political economy among federal policymakers in the US at the moment, where, surprise, surprise, the Fed is actually the sort of champion of some kind of interventionism. And it's actually Congress that is hidebound by, in a way that it absolutely needn't be, but is, by a sense that, the last thing is any kind of government intervention in the economy. It's a very peculiar political economy of policymaking in the US, where the policy space that exists is not being exploited as a result of the choice of Congress despite, ironically, exhortations coming from central bankers. And several consecutive Fed chairs have taken this position. Janet Yellen is another person I should give a shout out to on that type of score. Maybe having Yellen now at the Treasury will make an important difference. But I don't know. I mean, ultimately, you know, in the US system, Janet Yellen doesn't make fiscal policy. It's still up to Congress to do that. And there still seems to be a reluctance, you know, despite them, to move on to what Jonathan was saying. That's a great example, Jonathan. I'm glad to hear that that's true, right? That because the reason Giovanni's talk yesterday was really ramping up the pessimist side of things, and so I thought that what I would do today is at least try to suggest that there is some ground for optimism. There's something to work towards, even if we can't yet see it materializing. So it's great that you've actually come up with an example there where you think that you have seen it materializing. I think the problem, as we all recognize, this is the legacy of institutional economics, is that institutions really tend to be inert to the point where they collapse completely. And they can do that in dramatic style. And we saw that, for example, with borrowing and lending conventions back in 07, 08. I think the problem here is some of these policy conventions seem to be tougher nuts to crack. I mean, we've been arguing, I would say persuasively, for decades, and through the real experience now of two severe crises, that there exists space for policy maneuver. And yet, yesterday I heard, and I can sort of believe this, I think it was Antonella was saying this, weren't you, Antonella, that the real fear, say, in Italy, is that the liberation from the fiscal restrictions that come along with the Eurozone is going to be strictly temporary, and that at the first available opportunity, that the instruction will come down to nation states that, okay, crisis over, so now it's back to business as usual, instead of, the scale has fallen from our eyes, we've learned the lesson of the crisis, we need to now structurally change our policy thinking. That's the kind of hysteresis effect I'd like to see, by the way, a kind of hysteresis in conventional policy thinking, where the experience of the crisis has a lasting structural effect on policy going forward. But in fact, it's the one that I fear is a little less likely. But again, Jonathan, I'll take any encouraging sign that you can give me. And otherwise, I think that, Bill Murawski's position is what a lot of people think that they're seeing, right? Is that the harm that is being visited on people is precisely in the same pattern in the crisis that was established structurally over the last 30 to 40 years in the US. And so this really looks like a system that, many of us were saying after the Great Recession that neoliberalism now looks like an exhausted growth regime, nevertheless institutionally entrenched. When will this thing die? Well, all right, it took sort of a 15, 20-year period for full-fledged neoliberalism in the US, I would argue, to emerge from the crisis of the 70s and 80s. These aren't sort of 5-minute events. And that's something that's worth bearing in mind as well, right? If you take, I'm reluctant to sort of suggest that the world is mechanical as some of the long wave chronologies make it look. But if you take this kind of phases of growth perspective of capitalism, where, the golden age endured for several decades, its decay, and the emergence of neoliberalism took several decades, it's possible at least that what I call the neoliberal boom has now given way to a phase of institutional decay and change, and that something substantively different may emerge from it. But I do have to sort of caution that I think what is required for that substantively different institutional structure to be meaningfully different, as we would like to see it prescriptively as heterodox economists, is a change in the balance of power. And I think that's actually difficult to see at the moment. I would like to see that because that's what's needed, I think. But I honestly don't see it. In fact, there seems to be increasing disempowerment rather than any obvious sort of, remember the sort of stories of the golden age rested upon not just the bitter experience of a depression and 2 world wars, but in fact, the growth of economies and structural change towards manufacturing industry, where union representation was already strongest, and where union rights were slowly and finally being granted in countries like the US. You can see the kind of shift in power accompanying the sorts of traumatic events and the coalescing of the two, in some sense giving rise to productive change, at least in the direction of social democracy. And I think, by the way, we also have to have something to fear here from Eric Hobsbawm's. I seem to be citing an awful lot of British historians here. I apologize for that. Eric Hobsbawm has this short 20th century thesis where he argues that, look, forget all your long wave chronologies. The middle of the 20th century was a fluke that was essentially brought about not just by the Depression and 2 world wars, but crucially by the coincidence of, with those events, of the Soviet Union, a seemingly viable alternative to capitalism that really forced wealth in capitalism to concede and rule. Whereas, of course, the leitmotif of neoliberalism, thanks to Margaret Thatcher, is Tina. There is no alternative. And so, even if you can imagine, and I think even this is fanciful, a thorough resurgence in rates of unionization, is that threat enough in the absence of, all right, we'll just veto the whole system and switch to this one over here, which seems to be perfectly viable. Hobsbawm's argument is that it's, structurally and permanently game over. I hope not. Never mind Murawski's pessimism. Hobsbawm's pessimism is, back to the 19th century, right? That within 30 years we'll be putting children up chimneys again, as in Victorian England. That's I think the ultimate pessimist scenario. But I think, as political economists, as heterodox economists, we have to take seriously here this question of the balance of power. It's not just about ideas and getting ideas across and demonstrating their workability in short-term crises. I think it has to be backed by sufficient power if it's going to get traction in the form of a kind of new economic structure, as it were, structural change that fundamentally reforms policy thinking and the way the economy works. It can happen. The question is whether it will. And then this brings me finally to Olga. It's a great point, Olga. If we think the distributional consequences of the crisis have been bad so far, wait until we see the distributional consequences as we get to the vaccination. I think everybody is bracing for that. So you've drawn attention to, within Europe inequalities. The same thing is happening here, of course. The US is a continental size economy. Nobody thinks for 1 minute that this vaccination is straight into Bronx and Queens rather than into all of those people who are currently hiding in the Hamptons and Long Island and will then come flooding back into their multi-million-dollar apartments in Manhattan and start working in the financial sector. So both in the sort of small and in the large, I think there is a very legitimate fear that the distribution of the solution to COVID is going to very quickly start to look as bad as the effects of the crisis itself. Again, without wanting to just be positive, I think that's realistic. We can do something about this. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way. That's what we have to remember and keep working towards. The question is, I think, whether or not there is sufficient power to enforce a different distribution of outcomes. Unfortunately, I fear not.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to everybody. There was who wrote that we should be pessimistic when thinking, when reasoning, but in a sense, not only when we act, but also, sorry for the ring, but also when we have opinion about the future, some optimism can be good.
I agree. I think you're right, Sergio. There's a difference between expectation and hope. We live in hope. Right? That's an important part of the human
Okay. So thank you to everybody, and I hope to meet you again also in presence, so we can speak looking ourselves. And okay, so I close the conference, and I hope to meet you very soon. Bye bye to everybody.
Thanks again, everybody.